What I thought I would do, this is just to remind me of a couple of topics. What I'd like to do is spend about half an hour just sort of putting out on the table, just to sort of get current on what the issues are vis-a-vis Iraq, what kinds of elements are out there that we're currently working on, what's happened recently, and more importantly, what we see coming and how we hope to engage on that. And then I would use the rest of the time to answer, just really enter into a discussion with you, because as I was telling some of your colleagues before I came in, I really do hope to learn from you what some of your perceptions and thoughts are vis-a-vis Iraq, because it's important for us in the bubble of Washington to really hear perspectives, particularly from well-informed people like you who can help us think through some of the issues involved. What I thought I would do is try to lay out my sort of views or my sort of presentation in under a couple of general themes. The first would be security. And the good news is I really can spend much less time on security than I normally have in the past, because in fact the story on security in Iraq is pretty encouraging, and it has developed very well in recent months. And so I'll lay that out briefly. But then really I want to go on to two other primary areas. One is the kind of diplomatic engagement that Iraq is currently involved in the region. We talked a little bit about this with some of the students. We were talking particularly about Turkey, but there's a very good, much more important story of the general diplomatic engagement of Iraq as it stabilizes and resumes its real place in the region, particularly among the Arab countries of the region. And then I want to talk at some of the sort of the key issues that we're facing. A lot of them have, not we, I shouldn't say the Iraqis, frankly, are facing, but we're really committed to helping with vis-a-vis the economy and some of the other reform elements that really need to take place in order for Iraq, which is more or less stabilized from a security point of view now, to move forward in its political and economic dimensions. So let me start first with security, and I'm sure you followed Iraq well enough, even if it's not a particular area of your interest, as a generally well-informed person, to know that Iraq has been through a very difficult period in terms of its security, and a number of factors really undermined the effort of Iraqis and we and others in the international community to stand up a new Iraq following the removal of Saddam Hussein. And it had everything to do from internal elements in Iraq who rejected the new government, Al-Qaeda and other terrorists, and other countries in the region that were not willing to support the new Iraq. So there are a number of factors at play. And unfortunately, some of those elements were able to trigger a significant amount of violence, in particular a significant amount of sectarian violence within Iraq. And that is really the sad part of what has happened to Iraq in the last couple of years. But starting about 18, 20 months ago, things really did seriously begin to turn around, and we've now reached a point, or I should say the Iraqis, I should stop saying we, it's the Iraqis who've now reached a point where they've more or less stabilized their country from a security point of view. And that really then just sort of leaves all the other issues that they need to address, and there are many. But on the security side, as you've seen, the Iraqi communities largely have rejected violence as a means to seek their voice in the new Iraq. The Sunnis have come into the political dialogue. The extremists on the Shia side have either decided to join Muqtada al-Sadr, his people actually participated in the recent elections, or have been basically driven from their strongholds in the communities in which they used to be located. You may recall a little bit less than a year ago, the government of Iraq really did launch an effort to extend its authority throughout the entire country. And they really took on the Shia militias, particularly in Basra, Sadr city, and a city called Amara. They demonstrated that they were a non-sectarian government, that they were willing to govern on behalf of all Iraqis, and that they were willing to confront Shia extremists and sort of establish government control. And that was kind of a watershed development vis-a-vis the perception of the Iraqi people and I'll get to in a minute, the region in terms of what the new Iraq has developed as. And so the Shia communities began to accept, as the Sunni communities had already accepted, that the government was going to be able to provide the kind of security that they needed, and therefore they did not need to rely on their militias to attain that. And so you had, over the course of the last year, sort of the weakening and ultimately, essentially, the elimination of militias as an element of security, and the Iraqi government becoming seen and acting as a non-sectarian government. At the same time, of course, parallel with that was an increased capability of the Iraqi security forces. And so during the course of 2008, they increased in size, they increased in capability, and probably most importantly, they were able to sort of eliminate much of the sectarianism that had characterized them in the early days, particularly the army. But even the police have made significant strides. The police still have more work to do, but both elements have made significant progress in eliminating a sectarian aspect to them, such that, and the key is, they have essentially gained the trust of the Iraqi communities in where they're providing security. So they now have the manpower, the sort of the training, but also the trust to really be the security forces that provide security to the Iraqi people. And it's because of that that we really can begin to fundamentally shift our engagement in the country to a new dimension, and I'll get to that in a minute. So what you saw basically during the course of 2008 were a number of developments that came together that weakened or largely eliminated those forces within Iraq that were contributing to instability. And so now you've got a situation where there are still going to be the occasional, as you know, there are still terrorists, there are still extremists, and there are those who are setting off truck or car bombs and suicide vests. And that's unfortunately likely to continue because there are still such elements in the country. But they really enjoy no popular support. And so it'll probably have to play itself out for a while. But generally, Iraqis have resumed something like normal lives in terms of their everyday lives of going to school and going to the market and going to parks and just sort of doing kind of normal things. They're doing it in a security climate which is, has a very heavy security presence. You haven't seen the removal of all the T-walls and the checkpoints. That's still important, but they can nonetheless conduct more or less normal lives in terms of the way they go about their daily lives. So that then sort of means that they've shifted to having to address the other elements that have been that they still need to resolve. Let me just a couple of quick footnotes. During the course of 2008, you may be aware, we negotiated 2 new agreements with the Iraqis. One was the security agreement, and one was something called a strategic framework agreement. The security agreement, I think you're probably familiar with, it sets out a deadline at the end of 2011 for our troops to depart Iraq. And there's, obviously there's an anticipated transition from where we are today to that point at the end of 2011. And then likewise, the strategic framework agreement, that has no end point. That's an open-ended agreement. And basically what it does is it says that we, the United States, will remain committed to engage and support Iraq in a variety of areas to help build the country. Its economic, its technology, its health, its communications, its education, its culture. It's all the areas where we have expertise, capability, know-how. The Iraqis, as you know, are far behind their contemporaries and others because of what they've suffered in the last several decades. And so they need help, and we are committed through the Strategic Framework Agreement to working with Iraqis as partners to help them address those aspects of rebuilding and reconstituting their country. So those 2 agreements now really do become the fundamental agreements on which we build the future of our relationship. Before getting then to the specific issues that Iraq really will be facing in the coming period of time, as I was mentioning to some of your colleagues just before coming in, one of the really important developments of the last year has also been the improved regional engagement of Iraq with its neighbors. There was a time up until not all that long ago when most of Iraq's neighbors were really maintaining their distance to the new Iraq. They had not really been embraced by the Arab world. Initially with Turkey there was some tension. Obviously Syria and Iran continue to be concerns. And so Iraq sort of felt isolated and sort of felt that it wasn't receiving much support in the region. That really has changed fundamentally. In fact, just before coming here, I read a little item indicating that the Kuwaiti foreign minister visited Baghdad today. That's pretty historic. There has not been such a visit since before Saddam invaded Kuwait back in 1990. So you can imagine the symbolism of a Kuwaiti foreign minister going to Baghdad. And similarly, we had senior officials from many of the Gulf states, from Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan. King Abdullah from Jordan visited Iraq. And we've had senior Iraqi leaders visit a number of countries in the region, a number of the Arab neighbors. And that really is something, it's not all that visible, it's not something that people here typically would pay a lot of attention to, but it's a significant indication of the extent to which Iraq now has been brought back into the region and can now really begin to play a positive contributing role to stability in the region. Likewise, Iraq is opening embassies in most of these countries, and very, very importantly, these countries are opening embassies in Iraq. So there's kind of an end to that isolation period and an acceptance of this new Iraq, which really does have the prospect of contributing to stability and security in the region, unlike the old Iraq, which was one of the primary causers of instability and insecurity in the region. So let's just briefly look at 2009 and see what we've had and what we can expect, and kind of the issues that really will be the key ones that we will see coming over the next 11 or 12 months. First, point out, I'm sure you're aware of the very successful provincial elections that took place on January the 31st. And that really was, again, another kind of watershed or fundamental development, because a couple of things characterized those elections, which I find very encouraging, and I think the Iraqis have found very encouraging. Number one is what you saw. It was kind of a hybrid open list, closed list system, which means, I don't know if you're familiar with these European ways of voting parliaments, but you have a list of individuals on a party list, and you can vote for the individual at the same time. That means you're also voting for the party. So for the first time, because the previous elections were closed list, you only voted for parties. So for the first time, the Iraqi people actually had individuals that they could select. And that meant that there was accountability. That meant that people understand that they're being elected as individuals and will be held accountable as individuals. And that's a great step forward in terms of the way the democratic and the representative government there is being institutionalized. And so that message was not lost on the candidates for office. The second was that it had full support, full participation across all segments of Iraqi society. You may recall that 4 years ago, when the first set of provincial and national elections took place, the Sunnis boycotted, and the satirists and some of those in the Shia camp boycotted the elections. That meant that what you had was a skewed representation. You did not have governments, provincial governments, who accurately represented the communities that they were supposed to be representing. And that was an imbalance that weakened the overall system. That has now been rectified by the elections that took place last month. Everybody participated, and the outcome is accepted and is credible, and it looks like it has more or less given each community appropriate representation in the provincial councils of each of the provinces. And that will significantly increase the buy-in and the support by those communities for their provincial councils. And so that's a very positive step forward from where Iraq was before. And possibly the most important aspect of the elections that just took place was the fact that effectively across the board, they threw out the incumbents. They basically sent the message that we want a government that provides services. We want a government that does things for us. We're not interested in a government that postures on theological or sectarian or other areas. We want a government that delivers. And if you're not going to deliver, we're going to vote you out. And so you had effectively across the board, pretty much all of the incumbents were voted out of office. And I think that has sent a very powerful message to Iraqi leaders that this is an accountable system, that you really do need to be representing and working on behalf of the people. And finally, one other aspect that I think is important to note is that all the players, all the participants recognized that the way to get elected was to entice people, to convince people to vote for you, not to intimidate, not to use violence, not to use inappropriate means to try to force people to vote for you or to prevent them from voting for someone else. No, the system requires that you actually convince people to vote for you, and that's what they all set about to do. So all of those elements of the elections that just took place really are positive indicators that the institutionalization of representative and accountable government in Iraq is progressing. And of course, a key sort of signal of the success of that will be what happens at the end of this year when they have their national elections. But let me lay out a couple of the key issues that will be faced between now and then, and we'll all sort of get to see how successful Iraq deals with that. One is right now, they've got a reasonably stable country, but they have a very weak economy. And so the only way that they're going to really continue to succeed is to develop their economy. Because if you have high unemployment, if you have disaffection due to economic hardship or people not being able to provide for their families, that is destabilizing and potentially could contribute to a renewal of violence in the country. So they understand the value, the importance of getting their economy in order. And they have a number of challenges there. You may be aware that the Iraqi economy historically is a very centralized sort of command economy. It was one in which basically government revenues from oil were used to subsidize and support every aspect of the country, whether it was a bloated bureaucracy or state-owned enterprises or subsidies for basic items like food and fuel. The income to the country was used in ways that is not economically effective. But of course, under a dictatorship, that wasn't a key criterion. The dictatorship just simply used an iron fist to make sure that nobody complained. Well, in a democracy, you need to respond and provide for the people. And so those old systems really need to be revised. Now, it's hard to revise systems like that if you're used to getting subsidized electricity, or if you're an employee of a state-owned enterprise, which is highly inefficient, but the government just keeps bailing you out. You're not going to take kindly to somebody suggesting that, let's fix this, let's fire the people or let's shut down the state-owned enterprises, let's remove the subsidies from fuel and food and things like that. So it's going to have to be a delicate challenge for the government to figure out how to move from where they are today with the sort of the remnants of this kind of central command economy to an economy that actually can attract investment, that can generate private sector, real jobs, that can be competitive. They have an agricultural sector that has the potential for being the breadbasket of the Middle East, how to get that back on track, all the elements that will go into trying to fix the economy. So that's clearly one of the important issues that's on the table for Iraq. A second area that they really do need to address is some of the remnant disputes in terms of boundary lines in the country that are left over from the period of the post-Gulf War, when you had the region in the north, what's called the Kurdistan Regional Government. There was a kind of an artificial demarcation made for that region, and that was the region that we were committed to protecting from Saddam. Saddam accepted that, didn't try to challenge that. So you had that region, which has been essentially autonomous since 1991, but with a not well-defined border. That region now needs to be regularized. And so there's this swath of area, territory south of the current line, where there are what's called disputed internal boundaries between provinces and between the provinces south of Kurdistan and the Kurdistan Regional Government. And that's really one of the real remaining serious challenges to Iraq. There have been a number of efforts made to try to address that problem. The most critical part of that problem is the city of Kirkuk, and maybe you're familiar. The city of Kirkuk is an ethnically mixed city, which is currently south of the Kurdistan Regional Government, but has a significant Kurdish element to it. It also happens to have a lot of oil in that area, so there's an economic dimension to the city's status. And so they need to resolve what happens with Kirkuk, and then along with Kirkuk, these other areas. Now, you may be aware that because the area of Kirkuk is as contentious as it is, they actually took out the province that Kirkuk is in, Tamim province, and did not have provincial elections in that province because it was just too inflammatory to try to figure out what to do about Kirkuk. So they only had elections in 14 of the 18 provinces. They did not have them in the 3 provinces of the Kurdistan regional government because different rules apply in a region, and they did not have them in Tamim province simply because of the contentiousness of the Kirkuk issue. So the UN has been doing a study of the disputed internal boundaries issues, and specifically Kirkuk, and is supposed to provide an analysis and a set of recommendations to the government of Iraq probably within the next month or so that that discussion can go forward in terms of resolving those issues. At the same time, the government of Iraq, when they set aside Tamim province from the provincial elections, created a commission to look into the issue as well. And that commission is supposed to provide its input to the discussion at the end of March. They're a bit behind schedule. I don't think we're going to see their report by the end of March. But those two elements are basically pointing towards sometime in the spring or the latter part of the year, a real discussion and an attempt to resolve this fundamental challenge in terms of the relations among the elements in the country. So that's something I think you need to keep an eye out on. Another element that they still need to resolve is the whole hydrocarbons issue. And there's very good reason that they need to address that. As you're aware, as consumers, we're very happy that the price of oil is down. As exporters, the Iraqis are less happy that the price of oil is down. And so the decline in their revenues, a year last summer, you may recall when oil was where it was, their revenues were such that it looked like they were set to go forever. Well, oil's gone from, 140-something a barrel to less than 40. And Iraq itself has had trouble maintaining its own production levels. And so their exports have gone from about 2 million barrels a day to about 1.8 million. And so that, combined with the lower price, has seen their revenues fall significantly. And one of the problems that they face is they haven't yet been able to put together a new framework for their hydrocarbons sector, which then, once they have it, would get the international companies to come in and invest the huge amounts of money that would be needed to get the Iraqi oil sector up and running at the level that it has the potential to run at. They have the 3rd largest oil reserves in the world, and yet their production is nothing near what it could be. And of course, they've suffered for several decades of lack of investment and lack of maintenance. So they need to get that hydrocarbons framework together so that they can entice the international companies to come in and do the investment that will allow them to increase production so that even with lower prices, they will still have an income that will help them address some of the economic issues that I was just mentioning. So that's another area where I think you can need to keep an eye out in the next year or so. And the final area that I would just mention as an area that's going to continue to be a challenge, as you may be aware, there are many millions of Iraqis who have been displaced from their homes. There are an estimated 2 million Iraqis who are refugees in the region, probably the largest number in Syria, next largest number in Jordan, many in Lebanon, many in Egypt. So they've been displaced into other Arab countries, and the number is probably somewhere around 2 million. Within Iraq, there are an estimated about 2.4 million who have been internally displaced. Many of them, of course, from the time of Saddam Hussein, but many since then. And so there's been sort of this displacement problem that, of course, was accompanied, or sort of accompanied, a lot of the sectarian violence that took place in the last, say, 2 years or so. And so that sectarian violence, unfortunately, led to a certain amount of of segregation of communities that previously had been ethnically and sectarianly more integrated. And so to try to unwind that, or to try to reverse that kind of displacement will be a challenge, not just economic, which it will be, because people need to have homes to come back to, they need to have jobs to come back to, they need to have electricity if they're coming back, and water and things like that. So there's a whole essential services and economic dimension to getting people to come back, but there's also a security dimension to getting people to come back. You have to ensure that as people come back into mixed neighborhoods, that doesn't inadvertently or somehow set off the kind of tension or potentially even violence that actually caused the segregation to begin with. I don't think that is likely to happen, but it is something that the Iraqi security forces and the Iraqi governments need to be very cautious and make sure that they do it in ways that can be successful. Now, probably we won't see a complete return of everybody to their homes. There's just been too much change and too many new elements. So we'll probably see a certain amount of displaced persons moving to other locations, maybe remaining where they are or whatever. But there really does need to be a significant amount of returning of people to their homes so that the country can normalize and sort of cities and towns and neighborhoods can get back to something like normal. Part of that displacement problem has disproportionately affected Iraq's minorities, and I think that's going to be an issue that the Iraqis also need to address. You may be aware that Iraq is a country which traditionally has been sort of a very mixed group in terms of its population. It is majority Shia, but it has a significant Sunni population. Shia Arabs are probably about 60-65%. Sunni Arabs are probably about 15%. Kurds are about 15%. And the rest are a number of smaller minorities. There are Christians, there are Turkmen, there are Yazidis, there are Shabaks. There's a whole number of relatively small, altogether making up maybe about 5% of the population. But these communities, particularly the Christian community, have been integral, very essential parts of the fabric of Iraqi society. These communities, and as I say, particularly the Christians, have been a professional class, a well-educated class. They've been located around the country, and they really have been appreciated by fellow Iraqis for the role that they have played in Iraq and kind of this fabric of society role that they played, and the professionalism and their dedication to education and things like that. And unfortunately, they've been displaced in disproportionate numbers. And it's going to be difficult to sort of reintegrate them and give them enough of a feeling of security to come back into some of the areas. It's starting to happen. We estimate that about 200,000 displaced persons have returned to Baghdad. Not a lot, but some of them from minority communities. So it is possible and it is happening. But to get it to happen on the scale that really will finally sort of fix this aspect of Iraq is going to take a lot of effort. And the government is being enlightened about, the Iraqi government is being enlightened about how it's approaching it. They're using incentives. They're actually paying people who are squatting in somebody else's property. They're giving them a stipend to leave and go find quarters elsewhere. They're paying people a stipend who return to help them repair their homes or to set up and get themselves reestablished in the community. So they are using enlightened means, not sort of force and other means. They're using incentives to get people to try to unwind this displacement. But it's at the early stages. The implementation of these programs is not great, and the resources needed are significant. So those are things that we need to keep an eye on going forward. We, the United States, are committed to continuing to help the refugees, particularly the ones outside the country, but we also have programs that try to help those inside the country because we recognize the humanitarian aspect of this issue, and we're really strongly encouraging our allies and friends around the world also to contribute to supporting these communities. And we're seeing evidence. We just had the German foreign minister was just in Baghdad. The French president was just there. So we're seeing increasing engagement by friends and allies around the world in terms of helping Iraq move forward and address the issues that now remain to be resolved. So the overall assessment I would give is one of significant accomplishment on the security side, particularly on the political side in terms of developing Iraq's institutions. Those are looking to be stronger and stronger, with that whole list of other challenges that I just outlined still lying ahead before Iraq really can fundamentally stabilize and sort of look forward to playing a new role in the region and acting as a new kind of country in the region. But why don't I stop there? I hope I put enough topics out on the table to sort of give you some food for thought, and then ask for your comments, questions. As I say, I'd love to hear your perspectives and learn from you. I know many of you have been out in the region and probably have some interesting insights to share. So thank you for your attention. I hope you can all hear me, and look forward to whatever questions you have. I'll try to answer them. Thank you. Okay. You want to moderate? Or? I'll be happy to moderate and pick. Yes?
In addition to developing the oil sector, what other industries are you hoping to develop within Iraq?
Well, agriculture has traditionally, it still is the second biggest industry in Iraq. And they traditionally have been significant exporters of agricultural products. And they really do. They're one of the more arable countries in the region. And so there's a lot of effort going into fixing the drainage and irrigation systems that have been, a lot of it's dependent upon these kinds of irrigation systems. If you're a student of history, you'll know that it was way back in Mesopotamia that they first started digging these drainage and irrigation canals to develop agriculture. And so that's been going on for millennia. And that needs a lot of repair. So agriculture is clearly an industry where there can be a lot of employment and a lot of generation of wealth because, through exports, obviously, that's good for the country. Iraq, as a country that has a lot of energy resources, potentially, now this is down the road, but potentially could use those for doing energy-intensive industry. Now, they're not there yet, but if you look at Saudi Arabia has used its access to energy in ways that have allowed it to develop a number of energy-intensive industries. Potentially, that could be an area where they could work. So far, their state-owned industries do not particularly play to that strength. Their state-owned industries are just like the old Soviet state-owned industries. They're very inefficient. The government just props them up. They produce whatever the director says to produce, regardless of consumer demand, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't mean to say that those industries could somehow immediately or in any easy way be transformed into productive, energy-intensive industries. But in principle, given their energy resources, that would be an area that they could go into. But if they simply just sort of develop their hydrocarbon sector, that, first of all, could give a lot of employment and a lot of income, third largest oil reserves in the world, and I think they said the 12th largest gas reserves in the world, and the gas reserves haven't even been tapped at all, and that's a huge potential area. So I think between that and agriculture, you really could stand up a very robust economy, and then you could begin to go into other niche areas after that. But those two, I think, are the primary ones for Iraq to be successful fairly quickly. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, a lot of things that I've heard that I didn't hear you mention is that, and I don't know, this isn't my opinion, it's just things like that, but it's kind of a foregone conclusion that once the U.S. is totally out, then potentially we'll be civil war, and that was maybe why this started work so well, is that certain sides were kind of waiting and building up for when the United States was gone, and I just read, so I was just wondering what your opinion was on that. Is it, have things changed since those assumptions were kind of, in the media or even talks that were thinking?
Well, it's a very interesting observation, and I sort of smile, not because I don't think it's a relevant observation, because I think in a sense, sort of the joke has almost been on them in this way. Let me explain. I think there probably were elements in Iraqi society who felt that if the U.S. was going to shift its policy, do this surge and then leave, that in fact they could wait out this period of time. And when I say the joke is on them, I think what at least seems to have happened is during this period of time, the Iraqi institutions have strengthened to such an extent that anybody who thought they were going to do that is left out in the cold, because I think, I can't be sure, but I think the Iraqi security institutions and the Iraqi governance institutions are now strong enough that the average Iraqi places their faith in these institutions and therefore would not be amenable to reverting to that kind of way to sort out the society. So there might have been a year and a half ago, elements that thought, hey, no problem, we'll wait these guys out. When they leave, we'll just take over, because they were envisioning that Iraq would look something like it looked 18, 24 months ago. Well, Iraq doesn't look like that anymore. It has relatively capable, relatively accepted security institutions and now pretty well proven political institutions. Now, this year, with the next set of elections, that's going to be key, so I'm not taking any of this for granted. But what we're seeing right now is the time, and we'll see within a couple of weeks, actually, we're seeing the peaceful transfer of government at the provincial level right now. The key to democracy, I'm sure you students have all read this, is not elections. It's the peaceful transfer of governance from one elected government to another. If you do that, you can say you've got some success in democracy. You're seeing that at the provincial level right now. It hasn't happened yet because the government just certified the election results, I think 2 or 3 days ago. And you have 6 weeks from when those are when the election results are certified to when the provincial councils have to sit. And so we're in that coalition, the behind closed doors coalition building phase right now. But all indications are that all the participants have accepted the results, and they're using the seats they've gotten to go into coalition discussions with others who've won seats to try to come up with a government and that they will then peacefully take over from their predecessors. And if that happens, and we'll know that in a month or 5 weeks, that's the first major step towards documenting that the political institutions are holding. And then, of course, the big one is next year. When they have the elections at the end of this year, we anticipate, we hope, we expect, they will be peaceful, they will be politically contested, not by violence, but by campaigning, that whatever the results are will be seen as credible, and that the next government will be able to take power peacefully from the previous government. If we get to that point, I think all of us, mainly the Iraqis, can feel that these institutions now have been tested, and that basically at this point, they're working fairly well. So our own thinking, and I think the President will probably be speaking about this in the next few days, our own thinking is to try to make sure that we can continue to provide support to Iraq through this period, and then I think we'll be able to feel like we can seriously begin to leave Iraq much, much more to its own devices, because it will have essentially passed to a point where its institutions have proven themselves. Yes, sir.
The Sunni rejection of al-Qaeda and al-Anbar, sort of referred to as the Sunni awakening, there's been some scholars who have argued that it would have occurred naturally or was happening before the surge was enacted by the President in 2007. Is that true, or did the surge play a role, did the added security, as you talked about, play a role in encouraging Sunnis to step up and reject al-Qaeda and support the government?
Well, I think what I've read, and to the extent I'm familiar with the specifics, there does seem to have been a significant amount, or at least the beginning of movement towards this awakening, this rejection of al-Qaeda in early fall of 2006. And so you began to see some, as I understand it, some of the local Sunnis were actually approaching American forces in Anbar and talking about the possibility of allying against al-Qaeda. The surge wasn't launched, of course, until it was announced in January of 2007 and then sort of implemented in the following months. So yeah, there's no question that the time was ripe for this change. It wasn't like we came up with this great idea and said, hey guys, why don't you do this? They themselves knew that they had had enough of al-Qaeda. And so they expressed a willingness to ally with our efforts and that of their own government to establish control. And then that was one of the elements then that played into the success of the surge. So yeah, I think that's a key part, and it was because it was something that was ripe to happen. And so it could happen at the same time that the surge was implemented. Does that answer your question? Yes?
How long do you foresee an American president?
How long? Forever. Because we diplomats are going to be in Iraq forever. And I hope some of you are going to join the Foreign Service and go serve in Iraq. So no, I don't want to be facetious, but our diplomatic, our civilian engagement with Iraq, I would anticipate will continue as we have with 100 and some other countries in the world indefinitely. Our security relationship with Iraq, which is probably what you're actually referring to, will evolve. And I think, well, the security agreement indicates that what we would have by the end of 2011 is a disengagement of active U.S. security involvement in Iraq. But we understand, and I believe I know the Iraqis, I talked to the Minister of Defense last week, the Iraqis do want us to continue to help them build up their forces. In other words, train and equip and advise their military. That's not having active duty military forces out doing security in Iraq. So that will be done. But we will continue, I believe, to have a kind of advise and assist role as Iraq continues to increase the modernization of its forces. And we do that, of course, with dozens and dozens of countries around the world. So it would not be exceptional. It would not, to my mind, be controversial. It's a very standard thing that we do with allies where we work with them to strengthen their own military capabilities at their request and at their invitation. And I anticipate that will continue even beyond the time frame of the security agreement. Yes, sir.
Can you say a few words about the influence and interplay of Iran, both today and potentially in the future?
Yeah, Iran has been kind of enigmatic in terms of understanding its approach to Iraq. I mean, as you know, they fought a horrific war in the 1980s. It's kind of, there are different aspects to the relationship. Iran, of course, is a Shia majority country. Iraq is a Shia majority country. But Iran is a Persian country. Iraq is an Arab country. So there are all kinds of cross-cutting dynamics. The amount of trade between Iraq and Iran is very large, a lot of Iranian exports to Iraq. The amount of religious pilgrimage between the two countries is very large. So there's a lot of human interaction between the two countries. But I think, in general, Iran has had to reevaluate its expectations vis-a-vis Iraq. The latest elections, for example, certainly you could interpret some aspects of the election results in the South as kind of a message that they do not wish to see an overly sort of influential or involved Iran in Iraq. In other words, Iraqis seem to be saying that they do not favor those who want to have Iran have too much of an influence in Iraq. I think there's no means by which the Iraqis want to alienate the Iranians. I think the Iraqis want to have a very proper relationship, a productive relationship with the Iranians. But I think they are concerned that the Iranians may have had an idea of having more influence in the new Iraq than Iraqis are comfortable with or willing to accept. And I think Iran is sort of seeing that message and sort of recalibrating its approach to Iraq in ways that will be more acceptable to Iraqis. And that's fine, because it is important that they have a stable, proper relationship. They have a long border and a lot of common interests. We don't want tension. They don't want tension. But it's also important that Iran understand the limits to how much influence one country should have in another. So I think that's still working itself out. But as I say, I think some lessons have been learned, let me put it that way. Yes, sir.
Do you think there is a great opportunity to the U.S. to win the minds and the hearts of the Iraqis if they lead the affairs in the refugee resettlement?
Well, we've been very supportive of the refugee issue. The hearts and minds issue, that's a difficult one. As you know, it's been a very difficult period for Iraq. We've sacrificed a lot too, as you know. So there are many individuals who suffered, in the circumstances since the removal of Saddam, and obviously, they're going to have a certain attitude, having suffered personally, that is going to be difficult for us to overcome. I think broadly, however, as Iraq stabilizes, as its institutions become more secure, I think you will find that in general Iraqis will come to appreciate the new Iraq that they are now able to build. And that, I would think, ultimately would reflect positively on what we did to make a contribution to that. So I guess maybe time and developments will ultimately put us in a better position when it's, I believe, will be seen that we really did come in to try to help. And at the end of the day, Iraq really did end up with in a better situation, despite how difficult it's been. And I think we will be given some credit for that. And in that sense, I guess you could say, that would help win the hearts and minds. It is important that all of us support the displaced Iraqis and particularly the refugees, and we are the leaders in doing that. I would hope that there's a perception among Iraqis of appreciation for the fact of our commitment to that element of it. But, it's hard to know just how people perceive it. But, yeah, it would seem to me that that's an issue on which we should be seen as being rather generous, because we have been.
Can you follow up on that and give us some figures on that? Because that's not what I've heard.
On the refugees? Or
in terms of accepting...
Oh, bringing refugees here. Well, there are several elements of it. Obviously, there are many, many refugees in the region who need urgent support. So the UNHCR has put out requests for financial support. I don't have the numbers in the top of my head, but we provided well over 300, maybe over $400 million in support to UNHCR for these refugees in 2008, in, I think, fiscal year 2008. And I think we're on line to do about the same this year. That is by far the largest contribution of anybody. And frankly, we've been disappointed that some others haven't been more generous than they have been. So in terms of just generosity to support the refugees in place, we are head and shoulders above any other player on that score. In terms of refugees coming here, yes, it's been very difficult to ramp up the effort to do the screening and the checking and all that's required to bring them here. So in the first year or two, we were, unfortunately, the numbers were very disappointing. Last year, we had set ourselves a target of 12,000 and exceeded the target. I think we had 13,000 or something. This year, I think we set ourselves a goal of about 17,000, and I think we're on target to do that. It's clear that the refugee problem for Iraq is not going to be solved by having 2 million Iraqis take up residence in third countries, permanent residence in third countries. There are specific cases where it's appropriate, and everybody wants to make sure that people who can benefit by coming as refugees either here or to Europe or elsewhere are given the opportunity to do so. But really, the fundamental resolution of this problem is going to be to set the conditions such that Iraqis can, in fact, return to their own country where ultimately they would like to be, but unfortunately feel like in many cases they can't be there. And so our efforts will continue to expand, but I don't think anybody's going to ever believe that we can significantly address a problem of 2 million refugees through our own acceptance of refugees into the United States. So we'll take we're trying to take the most difficult cases, the most deserving cases, and expedite them. And in particular, those who supported us, worked for us, are seen as affiliated with us, and therefore potentially have a risk element that's more than others. But that's always going to be a relatively small part of what will ultimately be the resolution of this issue. Yes, sir.
Currently, I guess the United States is the most influential foreign power inside of Iraq towards the Iraq government. After our military presence is gone, will we continue to be? How will we rank? And what does the State Department do to make sure that our influence continues to be very strong there? And would having U.S. companies being very involved in the economy of Iraq be something that would continue the influence of the United States in the country?
Well, I think our engagement, call it influence, but certainly engagement leads to a certain amount of influence. Our engagement really should continue or should expand and be broad. I mentioned our own government engagement through the Strategic Framework Agreement ensures that we will be using all aspects of U.S. government capability to try to help Iraq stand up systems and institutions that help it succeed. I mean, everything from the having the Federal Communication Commission, provide advice to the Iraqis, to having the Center for Disease Control, provide advice to Iraqis. So we're actually launching programs in all of these areas to try to help them sort of stand up systems. Now, in doing that, inevitably, the kinds of systems and institutions they would stand up would mirror ours to some extent. And so in a sense, you could call that influence, but certainly there would be a parallelism that would give a natural affinity between, their organization doing X thing and our organization doing it. The private sector probably ultimately really will and should be the key element because there is obvious many things that Iraq needs. They've been, as you know, for 3 decades, underinvestment and destruction of infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So there's every reason for American companies and other companies, but we obviously want to encourage American companies to go in and get involved in Iraq economically with investment and with projects and things like that. There is money to be made in a country like Iraq, and there's also good reason to try to help what is now an ally succeed. So we will be encouraging American companies to make those kinds of investments as well. So I think our engagement level will remain robust enough, and our encouragement for private sector investment. And on the security side, as I mentioned, we do anticipate having a security relationship such that we will continue to help Iraq stand up capable security forces, and we'll help them with the hardware, but we'll also help them with the mentoring and the training and all that. So I think all of those kinds of sort of networks will ensure that U.S. involvement and sort of influence, if we could use that word, does continue going forward in Iraq. Other countries will also engage. That's good. We want them to. So yeah, we do anticipate that European countries will have robust engagement. Other Arab countries will have robust engagement. That's all very good. We will continue to have robust engagement. I think all of that will together ensure that Iraq has the support it needs to succeed. And so I guess I don't look at it as a zero-sum game. It's sort of like everybody who's contributing, who's sort of all on our side, that's all good for Iraq succeeding. And we will be a big part of that.
Is Russia on our side in that environment where you're saying everybody is welcome? We all
the Chinese potentially could invest in sectors there. Russia could invest in sectors there. Because they would be economic investments. They're not seeking political hegemony. They're not trying to turn the Iraqi government one way or another, nor are we, nor is anybody else. But if it's simply economic investment, that's good. That helps Iraq. The more investment they get, the more successful their economy is. We don't want anybody going in there with political strings attached, but nobody seems interested in doing that, and so that's good. So other countries that might potentially invest, we would encourage that, but not those that potentially could have political strings attached. That's not appropriate. It should be economic investment for the profit of the company investing and the benefit of the economy being invested in. That's a good thing across the board. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the councils were sort of successful.
The provincial, did you say provincial council?
The elections, I'm sorry.
Oh, the elections, yeah.
But in light of that, Medicare winning 9 out of the 14 provinces and him now calling for more centralization over federalism, do you really think that he has any intention, after our disengagement, of ever implementing Article 140? I mean, the way it seems, it doesn't seem that way.
Well, of course, Article 140 is one element of it. The Provincial Powers Law is an important element of it. Article 140 is the part of the Constitution that talks about resolving the internal boundaries of the country, It was supposed to have been done when 2006 or something, or 2007. It hasn't happened yet. What happens with the seating of the new provincial councils is the new provincial powers law goes into effect. And that changes the relationship between the central government and the provinces, particularly in two areas. In the area of security, the provincial government has authority over provincial and local security forces, not the army, but they have power over the police and other local security forces. And in terms of the budget, they have the power, they have full power over the provincial budget. And you may not know, it's not common knowledge, that the government of Iraq right now is committed to and is implementing what you might call revenue sharing. They're providing revenue to each province based on the population of that province. So they're providing an equitable distribution of revenue to the provinces based on population. Those resources now will be completely under the control of the provincial governments. So those two new elements of power under the provincial powers law will in fact represent a certain element of federalism that has not been in place before. Now, I agree with you completely that Prime Minister Maliki continues to have an overly centralized view of how the Iraqi government should be. I'm sure you're aware that Iraq forever has been a very centralized government. And so that is sort of common thinking among Iraqis, particularly of Iraqis of a certain generation. But there are laws in place. And so we will see, and I'm confident, that at the end of the day, the laws that sort of determine the nature of federalism in Iraq will in fact be implemented. Now, specifically resolving the borders under Article 140, that's kind of a separate issue in terms of the ongoing functioning of provincial governments and the federal government. But that also does need to be resolved, and it needs to be resolved peacefully. So that we'll see, and as I pointed out, some significant elements are coming forward soon on that. But I do see that as separate to the issue of figuring out the balance of power and the separation of power between the central government and the provincial and regional governments. And there's still the issue of there's one region in Iraq, the Kurdistan Regional Government, and that has a special status with special authorities. And so again, that's all part of the federal system. It's still working itself out. There's still a lot of details that need to be resolved. But fundamentally, they're on a course to define a division of power that will lead to a federal system. And so Maliki's own thinking notwithstanding, I think the systems are in place to lead to a reasonably decent federal division of power in Iraq. Yes? Yes.
May I ask you a question?
Sure.
First is, could the Anbar awakening have happened earlier if the coalition provisional authority were less hostile to tribes, or did the Sunni Arab Anbar have to be ruled by Al-Qaeda and Islamia first to find out how it actually works?
Good question.
Second is, do the ballot returns from January 31st indicate that the remaining population of Baghdad is only about 15% Sunni Arab, or do you think ballot returns are not enough evidence to make that difference?
Well, on the first question, I mean, it's ultimately, I think, going to be some historian, maybe from the University of Chicago, who will look into the issue of what sequence of events took place to cause what we saw. It's hard to say, and this is something I've also thought about, to what extent do communities need to experience, how should I put this? In other words, what they experienced was a level of violence which convinced them that this was not in their interest. And the question is something that I don't think anybody could ever answer, is to what extent do communities that have aspirations, in this case it would be the Sunni communities of Iraq, which felt themselves to be disenfranchised with the removal of Saddam, to what extent can those aspirations only be tempered by the very difficult experience of the violence that they experienced as a result of those aspirations, and to what extent can one just convince them to not go through that crucible of violence and just accept giving up the aspirations that they might have had to somehow gain an upper hand or to get more enfranchised in the country. And that's a hypothetical question that I don't think anybody will ever be able to answer. I think it was very unlikely probably that at the very beginning the Sunnis would have just accepted that they've been disenfranchised. From their point of view, their interpretation was they were disenfranchised, and that's okay, we'll just, we used to rule the country for decades and centuries, and now the Shia are going to basically have hegemony, and, we'll just accept it. I think it's not realistic to think that that would have been something they would have done. And so to some extent, they had to come to an understanding that they could still have their voice through the new Iraq, but they wouldn't have the kind of sort of hegemony that they had had in the past. And how you get them from where they were, the day after Saddam was removed, to where they got to be when they started reaching out to U.S. forces and the Iraqi government to try to sort of get back into the political system, how you get from one to the other, and how much violence is really needed to make them convinced of that is something I think will always be, we'll never really know. I think ultimately they recognized that if they pushed hard enough, the Sunnis actually had enough power to push back, and that they were basically always going to lose on a violence effort to try to push their agendas forward in Iraq. And so therefore, the alternative was the political dynamic. That's what they've now embraced, and they're finding that, in fact, they get a voice. And in Anbar, for example, up in Nineveh, where they have, Anbar obviously a large majority, in Nineveh a plurality, they have now the political power that they didn't have before. So they've learned that that's something that actually has worked for them. On the second issue, I just don't know enough about what actually happened in terms of, you obviously must have studied the election results, and I guess you're suggesting that 15% of the votes in Baghdad were for Sunnis. Is that, I don't know what the facts are, but that's what you, and if that's the case, if that's a reflection of the Sunni number in the city, I just don't know. That's kind of a detail that I'm just not familiar with.
The refugee problem. A lot of refugees in Syria and Jordan are Sunnis, and they came from Baghdad.
Yeah, okay, well then, in that sense, what you're suggesting is now, unfortunately, or practically speaking, it was really not possible to allow refugees outside the country to vote in the provincial elections. And so those refugees outside the country were not able to vote. And as a result, if the large numbers of Sunnis who may have been originally from Baghdad were not able to vote. Displaced persons in Iraq were able to vote in the provincial elections. So if you were displaced within Iraq, you could go to your neighbor, your polling place, and vote for your home province. So if you were displaced from Baghdad to Erbil, you could go in Erbil and vote for the slate from your home from Baghdad. So the 2.4 million or so displaced from within Iraq did have the ability to vote. The approximately 2 million displaced outside Iraq did not have the ability to vote. Now, unfortunately, you can imagine the complexity of this voting process. You had 14 provinces, you had over 14,000 candidates, and then potentially you had to make all the ballots for all 14 provinces available to voters in all 18 provinces, because the displaced persons in that province should be able to go and vote in their local polling place. So the complexity is mind-boggling, and unfortunately, there were a lot of glitches in terms of voter registration lists, particularly for displaced persons. So unfortunately, there were instances, a number of instances, in which displaced persons who thought they were going to be eligible and able to vote got to the polling place and were not able to vote. It was not an orchestrated thing. It was not a deliberate thing. It was really just an outcome of the complexity and some misunderstandings. I think some of the displaced persons didn't realize they had to actually authenticate their distribution list registration and things like that. So I think there was a number of factors, unfortunately led to a number of displaced persons not having the opportunity to vote. But generally, I believe the Iraqi people and the High Electoral Commission really have certified that the results really do reflect. In other words, there was no disenfranchisement or fraud of a level. There was some of both, but there was not enough of either to cause the results to be illegitimate. In other words, to change what would have been the outcome if those elements had not taken place. That's the general consensus both of the Electoral Commission and the Iraqi people, and the UN, which was heavily involved in overseeing this. So the general outcome has been one in which it is believed that the Iraqi people's voice was accurately reflected in the outcome of the election. Yes, sir?
What was the result of the election grossly?
Pardon me?
What was the result of the election grossly in terms of Sunnis, Satirists, and Maliki? And is there a fourth group?
The Kurds.
Well, the Kurds presumably were 100% for the Kurds.
They were 100% for the Kurds, but they lost significant sort of representation that they had gotten in the earlier voting where others didn't participate. Nineveh is the example. In Nineveh province, which is a very mixed province, Mosul is the capital, the Kurds used to have a majority of the provincial council because the Sunnis boycotted in 2005. This time, the Sunnis got the Kurds about 25%, and the main Sunni list got 48%. So that provincial council will fundamentally change from a Kurd-dominated provincial council to a Sunni-dominated provincial council. In the south, the change was primarily that Maliki's Dawa party, which is a Shia-affiliated or identified party, gained at the expense of ISKI, which is the Abdulaziz al-Hakim Islamic. Do you remember ISKI? Could you tell me what the is? Yeah, they go by ISKI, so it would be the Iraqi Supreme, the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, maybe. Anyway, it's ISKI. It had been the most dominant Shia-associated party. They lost significantly in the south with Maliki gaining the upper hand. Anbar, of course, turned over completely from what was IIP to now. IIP, I think, came in third. It's a Sunni group, but it was the only Sunni group that participated in 2005. So even though it didn't represent the majority of the community, it got overwhelmingly the majority of the votes. They now, I think, are in third place in Anbar, behind the Awakening group and then one other group. It's a Sunni group, not Tawafuk, but anyway, one of the other Sunni groups that also stood up this time for the first time and participated. So there have been significant changes, and again, it was sort of throw the bums out was kind of the overall outcome of the election. The people were dissatisfied with the services and the governance they were getting, and made it quite clear. So does that answer the question?
Well, mainly on mine, actually. How well did the Sadr group?
Sadr's lost. They didn't run officially as a group, but they backed certain candidates, independent candidates. And overall, the votes they attracted declined. So overall, they were also sort of came out worse. So, the Dawa improved, ISKI and Sadr declined. The Sunnis changed significantly. The Kurds declined not because Kurds didn't vote for them, but they just had others voting who hadn't voted before. So a lot of significant changes have taken place. But the end result, the good end result, is that these provincial councils really are seen as being reflective of the communities in the province. And that gives them a legitimacy that was a real Achilles heel before, because that was not the case with many of the previous provincial councils. So that's a very positive step forward. Okay, I've almost worn out all the questioners here.
Back to industry, how much do you think private investment is going to diversify the economy? And if it fails to diversify, what's to keep to Iraq from becoming another petro state where the elite that controls the oil industry basically makes the democratic institutions irrelevant?
Well, Iraq obviously is going to be a country in which oil revenues play a dominant role, both in the government and in the economy. When you have the third largest oil reserves in the world, that's inevitable. But it can be channeled properly, and I really am optimistic that what will happen is if you have an accountable government, which you have, and as you sort of move forward in developing the hydrocarbon sector, you will get a government which is using these resources for the benefit of the people. Otherwise, they're going to get voted out. And so they will set up an economy that is most beneficial for the people. And that will be a hydrocarbon sector which maximizes the amount of income that you can get from the hydrocarbon sector, and then uses that income either to help the people directly. You know, they currently have all kinds of subsidies and things, although I think they recognize that's not an efficient way to actually help the people, or to just provide the infrastructure that allows for a robust economy. So you can imagine if you have a government which has significant resources, if they build the roads and bridges and the power lines and the pipelines and all the things infrastructure-wise, the rail lines, et cetera, that make it a very attractive and profitable place for private sector investment, they'll get that private sector investment. And that's ultimately the best way to make Iraq's economy work best for the most people. And so I think they'll actually be under pressure to do that because ultimately they're accountable to the people. And so I think that's what I think you're going to see once they're fully stabilized and once the international investment community feels comfortable making the kinds of major investments. There are already a number of significant investments going on in Iraq, a lot of it in things like housing and hotels and those kinds of things. But we don't yet see significant investment in industry because largely you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the reliable electric supply and the transportation system and the things that you would need for a successful industrial type development. That should come. I mean, I think that's going to come sooner rather than later. But ultimately, it's that kind of investment that I think is going to cause the Iraqi economy to really take off. And that's something the government will support because they're an accountable government. The people are watching, and the people are expecting them to use their resources wisely to help to help the economy take off for the benefit of the people. So how about, I guess I have time for one last question before everybody goes off to do their homework.
So the debate and the controversy around the invasion was huge and very tough, but we're past that. 2 years ago, we were very concerned about what the outcome was going to be. But now where we are today, given that we're reaching some relative stability, how does your vision for the region, how has your either vision changed, or what is your vision for the region, and how much history?
There's a lot of history in this region, as you know. Actually, your question reminds me that I did promise one of the individuals here that I'd say something about Turkey. So let me say a little bit about the region, and I'll say something about Turkey. I think if we get to the point, and we're pretty close, that Iraq becomes a stabilizing element in the region. Iraq's a major country in the region with major resources and a large population and a significant influence. And in the past, that influence has been pretty much universally negative. If Iraq can become a country which contributes to stability in the region and contributes to good governance in the region and sort of is seen as a country which is benign and helpful in general in the region, that certainly will be a positive change and a positive contribution to the region. Already we're seeing some encouraging signs. I mentioned a little bit about the regional engagement. I didn't mention Turkey. Iraq and Turkey now have better relations than probably ever before. And that's a huge positive because Turkey obviously is the gateway to Europe, and also it's a large Muslim country, and they have a Kurdish minority, as Iraq does. And yet with all of that, those two countries are seeing more and more eye to eye, and even the Kurds in Iraq are engaging very positively with the Turkish government, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a nice stabilizing element. If Iraq can continue to build on its relations with the other Arab countries, I think that will give the other Arab countries a significant sort of increase in confidence of their own situation, that they as a group are stronger and more capable. And that could have some positive impacts in the region. I mean, vis-a-vis Iran, right now there's a great deal of disquiet, a great deal of concern among Arab countries vis-a-vis Iran and its intentions and its actions. And Iraq, which contributes to and participates in kind of an Arab world that's strengthening, will help in that dynamic. And even potentially, and I don't want to speculate too much, but potentially even in the Arab-Israeli conflict, again, the more that there's an Arab world which feels like it's progressing, it's stable, it's secure, it has confidence, the more that that happens, I think the better it is ultimately for this overall issue. And again, Iraq could contribute, I think is already beginning, to contribute to a sense among Arab countries that they're stabilizing and they're moving forward. So a positive outcome with Iraq, and there's still a lot of work to be done, as I've been trying to say, I don't want to gloss over that, but a positive outcome with Iraq in the region could have a number of positive impacts in terms of stability and confidence among the players in the region as they address the other issues that are out there, and there are plenty. So anyway, well, thank you everybody for your attention, and I expect at least a significant percentage of you to join the Foreign Service. So sign up, take the exam. People like me want to retire, and that means you guys have to come in and take over. So anyway, and good luck here. And I know some of you are going off to internships with the State Department or with embassies. I encourage that. Please do that, and all the other work that you're doing. So thanks for the invitation. Thank you for the nice introduction, and best of wishes to all of you here at the University of Chicago.